Hello and welcome to this episode of the Superhero Ethics Podcast. Today, myself and Paul Hoppy are taking your questions on this special feedback episode. We're talking about colonialism. We're talking about what it's like to grow up in a literal version of Ba Sing Se. And we're actually asking the question, what would happen if you had an insurance adjuster in a world of superheroes? All this and more after a commercial break we have no control over. Welcome back. My name is Matthew. I'm joined by regular co-host and guest, Mr. Paul Hoppy. Paul, how are we doing today? How are we feeling about this topic?
What topic? Oh, like people saying things? I mean, I say I don't really like conversations and stuff, but I do. And I really appreciate a lot of the feedback that we've gotten over time. Especially when people say I might have noticed something that someone else might not have. But
I was going to say, you and I are both narcissistic enough that we like feedback.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, oh, people are listening. Like, I early on, especially, like, I was just like, yeah, I'm just going to get on Skype and have a nice chat with Matthew. And, like, I'll have Audacity on, usually. And there might have been one time. Oh, hit record. Oh, the red button. But yeah, it is nice being like, oh, people are listening and appreciating or not appreciating, or people pointing something out that we didn't think of or didn't mention. Every time I listen to an episode, I'm like, oh, I should have mentioned that. I should have mentioned LA Confidential. We're talking about, like, killing and not killing, or,
Oh, yeah, that would have been such a good point for that one.
But we might not have managed to keep it under 2 hours. But so, yeah, I'm really looking forward to reading or hearing all of these and, having little conversational vignettes in response to them.
Yeah, I think I totally feel the same way. I love seeing the feedback, both because it's just great to know that we're helping to inspire these conversations, but also because, I mean, to me, it's it's a fun narcissistic thing, to be sure. Like, I love that people enjoy what we're doing here, but I love the idea that we're putting ideas out there and other people responding and bouncing off ideas, and a lot of times pointing out things that I totally missed. There's one email in particular we're going to start with that is really about something where I was just like, oh, yeah, that was a total thing I missed, and adds so much to the conversation. And it just gives me hope, and also I'm glad folks are writing in, and I want you to keep doing so, but also it just gives me kind of happy feelings thinking about what are the conversations that you're having with your own communities and friends. We recently saw on Twitter that the Star Wars podcast, the other one that I do, that Paul's a frequent part of as well, that there's a number of folks in Germany who are tweeting in German to each other about this podcast. So it just makes me so happy to hear all that.
Yeah, I especially enjoy that one because I watched half of the Clone Wars in German, so it was fun seeing some feedback in German, and I think I even managed to crank out a response that hopefully was coherent in German.
Yeah, my Google Translator told me it was.
Oh, so excellent! It must be good.
Probably have to say. Well, so let's dive into the feedback, and the first one comes from listener Kamal Moisey. I hope I'm pronouncing your name wrong. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Know that if I'm not, please understand you're in very good company. But obviously, if I'm getting that name wrong, please let me know. But Kamal wrote into us about the TV show of Invincible, which, Paul, I know you haven't seen yet, but you said you're not going to probably watch anytime soon, so you're okay being spoiled. And with all these, we're going to be kind of talking about a number of different topics. So if you haven't seen something, feel free to skip ahead. I'm actually going to try and put into the show notes, like, we start talking about this topic at minute 7, and we stop at minute 15, or whatever it is. So if you haven't watched Invincible and you're still planning to, feel free to skip ahead, because we're going to get pretty far into the details. But for those who either have seen it or who just don't care, the core of the show is about a person named Omni-Man, who we find out comes from a planet called Viltrum, who wants to conquer Earth. And I said during our episode about it that one of the things I thought made the show a little weaker than I wanted it to be was that we never really got much of a motivation beyond just, we think we're the best and we want to conquer everybody. And, I talked about how I love good villains. I love villains who have a strong motivation, and that this felt a little, kind of Chancellor Palpatine, ultimate power, mwahaha, mustache.
And this dude does have a mustache, right?
He does.
So
he does.
I can see where
there's definite twirling possibilities. And he's voiced by Jameson.
Simmons
yes, C.B. Simmons, something like that. I should know it, but J.K. Simmons, who is the voice of, among other things, who played J. Jonah Jameson in a version of the Spider-Man
Right.
movies. So, yeah, anyway, long tangent. But the point is, what Kamal pointed out to me was, he just, we had a long email back and forth, and so I'm not going to read all of his emails, but he started out by saying, like, what I was missing was colonialism. That the word is just, they're colonizers, and that's what, and as he pointed out, and I think, and rightly so, that, that's what white European folks or other folks as he pointed out, like, in our own world, that's what white European folks did, and that it would make sense that for other worlds, like, and that colonialism could sometimes just be boring. He actually said, Paul, that he thought that you would have gone right to that word, and so clearly it's more my blindness, which may well be true.
Perhaps.
And what he said was, though, as we went back and forth, he wrote, "I'll admit that narratively colonizers, supremacists, racists, etc., is boring, but that's because it is. And maybe it's my bias as a black male living in the U.S. with zero faith in humanity, but I find that the most well-meaning allies, no offense, none taken, fall into the trap of wanting it to make sense. Quote, how could you, assumed racist person, think X about an entire group of people? And then, end quote. And then he says, and yes, I see the irony in defining all racists by a singular trait, but I think it's legit. And then he keeps going, but that's it. It's boring and illogical. Omni-Man tells Mark, we decided that we should be the only civilization in the galaxy. They can be a part of us or die. All of your questions, my questions that I asked in the episode, about narrative are lampshaded by we decided. How are U.S. sports teams world champions in a sport no one else plays? Why do, quote-unquote, we choose the current society we have when we would be better off being more equitable at the cost of like 100 people giving up 5% of their wealth? Quote, because fuck them. I'm better. I deserve it. I.e. that's the supremacist attitude. It's all ethically wrong and narratively boring. But like you mentioned in the cast, Invincible, the show, does a great job of using the cultural shorthand we have to save time on basic world building and focus on the story they want to tell. We know what colonizers are. We also know what the basic superhero tropes are. And overall, I think that led to a great tight first season with plenty of room to explore new topics and possibly elaborate on these ones in future seasons. So, Kamal, thank you so much. I think there's a great point you're making here about the colonizers that I said in our emails back and forth that I very much agreed with, that I missed. But Paul, I wanted us to kind of get into more of a conversation of it because I think it raises both kind of questions about what can be our blind spots as viewers, but also just this question of how do you balance kind of narrative interest in storytelling with the fact that if you're trying to tell stuff about, that reflects the evil in our own world, evil is boring sometimes, especially when it's sometimes racism, supremacy, like it's not because there's some inner motivation or it's just because people are supremacists.
Yeah, it is. As a white-looking, male-looking person living in the U.S. with zero faith in humanity, I will say that while I have not been subject to a lot of the things that a lot of people in this country and all over the world are subjected to, I see it, and
right.
and just it is boring. Like looking at the news and seeing, somebody tell people in another country, like, don't come. Or what was the exact phrase? But like, just don't come. Like, that, the lack of caring that people show to others and the immense power that is wielded by so few and then sort of distributed amongst classes of people in like varying degrees and varying layers to kind of oppress other classes of people who then can in turn oppress other classes of people, like while colonizing the whole world and not calling it colonization because it's like, oh, well, we're just this country. We just have a military base there and a military base there. And like, yeah.
Or we just get their entire population to start dressing the way we do and watching our shows and eating our fast
buying
food.
our jeans.
But that's not colonialism, so we didn't conquer
Exactly. And, the literal conquering, like, it's like, there's often this like justification to oneself, right? Of like, oh, well, we're doing it for their own good because the government there is oppressing the people, so we're gonna overthrow that and and change it. And I think that's a very powerful lie, because a lot of times the government there probably is awful and oppressive and probably is oppressing a lot of the people, but it's not getting replaced by a non-oppressive government. That's just not what's happening, right? And there is this very selfish just mining of resources, but usually there's this combination of like, well, we're the best and we want them to be able to be part of the best. And I think that was the idea behind the Roman Empire, right? I think it's very clearly the idea behind the American Empire. And it sounds like in this show that's, this alien empire, I guess, that's like what they're doing as well. And, very rarely you'll get someone like, Leopold II of Belgium, who committed just unthinkable atrocities that, yes, there was immediate gain, right, in terms of natural resources, but there was also just a level of cruelty that, there couldn't possibly have been a sense like, oh, we're actually helping these people. But like, that's an outline. I was just watching Chomsky have a argument with Buckley, I think, on some YouTube video that for some reason YouTube suggested. I can't imagine why, but
Noam Chomsky and William F. Buckley, I assume is who
correct,
you're talking about.
Correct. And this ended up being an example, which was like the second time today somebody brought up King Leopold, and the first time somebody was like, we should be saying that instead of like Hitler all the time, and like it's true, but like.
Just for anyone who doesn't know, King Leopold was the ruler of Belgium in the late 19th century, when Belgium was the rulers of what was known as the Belgian Congo, and is now now is a number of African nations in Central Africa, including Republic of Congo. And they were just, as you said, the atrocities were horrific. I think it's estimated that at least 10 million Africans were killed during his reign. Horrible things like that.
Right, and like cutting off people's hands, then making them hold them while you take a picture of them. Like, the fuck is that? Like, that's some demon shit, That's like some next level, like, villainy, just real villainy. And we have that in our own world. It's often not that bare anymore. Right. And there's usually this kind of like, we're going to cover it up with like, no, but we're doing this to like, make things better for people there. But like, it's a lie that one tells not just to others, but I believe also to oneself. And I think that's one of the things that makes it so powerful and effective.
Right.
Like, is that interesting in fiction? I don't know. Maybe to some people. Like, there was something, I think, when you did the Wonder Woman 84 episode, was that with Jessica Plummer?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, and she made a point that I really enjoyed, where I think you also made a point about Max Lord character, I believe? Mm-hmm. And how he was a little bit of a mustache twirler, and it was like, kind of like, why does he want all this power? And her point was just like, some people just do. And it's like, it's not that interesting in terms of like their character, right? And it's like, sometimes that's a type of villain, And I do think we should have some of that type of villain. I think if that's the only type of villain that we ever get, I think that's very boring. But I also think if we only ever get the kind of villain who's like really conflicted and like really believes that what they're doing is the best, like maybe that's more compelling for some people, and maybe sometimes it's more compelling, especially if it's done really well. But like, personally, like, all right, I'm gonna take a swipe at Infinity War here. Like Thanos is supposedly this kind of like, he's kind of like a reverse colonizer, I guess, right? Mm-hmm. He's like, instead of colonizing here, I'm just gonna, maybe he is just literally a colonizer, but like, he just goes and he kills half the people, and then he's like, okay, things are better for you now. But like, I don't think any of that ever made any sense. I think if he was just a villain who was just like, I fucking hate people and I like killing them, like, that movie would have worked better for me.
I mean, his original motivation in the comics, in which they definitely teased in at least in the first time he's introduced at the end of Avengers, is that he's just trying to get in the pants of the literal embodiment of death. And it's like, look, I'm going to impress you by killing half the beings in the universe. And that's the line where he says, like, to fight the humans is to court death. Yeah. Like, that's the fun, like, entendre there.
Yes.
I think I agree with you, and I think you're right. I think sometimes you do want a villain who's just evil, and you just want to see them punched in the face. I think the thing you were saying about the lie is maybe kind of a better way to crystallize what I was trying to say, because I think the colonialism point is so important, and like I said, I just missed it. I'm so glad we pointed it out. I think though that the lie is the part that was missing, because there wasn't any of the, well, we think we're making the Earth better for the Earth people, or we think we are, or even just like Earth has this natural resource we want, which was, a huge part of the Congo.
Sure.
Or even in Congo, it was more even just like France has its empire, England has its empire, Germany has its empire, so we, Belgium, need to be like a huge power too. I mean, so much of it is just like the
keeping up with the colonizers, basically. So.
Yeah, exactly. And just on that same point, I also just want to kind of reiterate something you said, that, like, I think any kind of idea of, like, was Hitler worse, was Leopold worse, was this other, like, horrific person worse is kind of dumb.
Yeah.
But the fact that Hitler is a household name and King Leopold is not it's because Leopold's victims were black. Like, I don't think there's any question about that.
Absolutely.
But yeah, so and I think that's where I think if there had been at least some semblance of that lie, I think that's kind of what I would have wanted more narratively. But I think what Kamal's saying kind of has me convinced, and some of what you're saying too, that sometimes the villain's motivation can just be like, just we wanted to be the biggest kid on the block.
Right.
We wanted to be the Empire, and that's to some extent the frustration with it. Of like, but that like that would have even been a great thing to see people explore more in season 2. And granted, all this comes from comic books, and so maybe this is explored, or maybe it will be explored in season 2. I'd kind of love it if, because the other main character of the season 1 of the show is Invincible, Omni-Man's son, who until the last minute really can't believe that his father could be this evil. And I'd kind of love it if maybe like a big part of season 2 is him trying to find the reason.
Oh, sure.
Trying to find some reason to, not to justify, but still to be like,
to understand.
How can I have some degree of sympathy for where my father's coming from, even as I know I have to stop him? And eventually having to come across this kind of banality of evil point of, he's just a person. It's just supremacy and colonialism. Yeah. He just thinks that his people are better than everyone else, and all of his people do, and that's how they've been raised, and so to them, the people of Earth just don't have moral value.
Right.
I love to see if they explored that in season 2.
Yeah, that sounds like a really interesting take on it. Like, I really like the idea of searching for that reason, and like, because I think sometimes like when you see a villain, or when I see a villain, like, or just somebody I disagree with in maybe like a really important personal matter where I really want to change their mind. I'm totally not referencing something that's going on in real life right now, but like,
yeah.
I'm trying to figure out like why they believe what they believe, or why they want what they want, because then maybe I can convince them. But sometimes there's not some real clear motivation. Sometimes, there's a saying like, you can't reason someone out of a position they didn't reason themselves into.
That I've never heard that, but that's a really, really good way of putting it.
Where it's like, look, there isn't something I can say that's going to change their minds, because for whatever reason they've decided this is what they're going with. And, sometimes you can't understand why somebody has such malice and does such horrible things. It's just maybe what that person wants to do. And, as a, prison abolitionist and someone against the state murdering people, or, in polite conversation, the death penalty or penalty. Oh, that, yeah, no. It's hard to think of like, but what would you do with those people? Because that is some very small subset of humanity. And I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that, but it sucks because there are people like that.
I think you make a really good point. Like you, I'm against the prison system. I am very against the death penalty, but I recognize that, like, I want to believe in restorative justice. I want to believe in helping people find new ways they can be in their lives, but that's not going to be true for everyone. But I would also even expand it to, I think there's another larger group that we can have this conversation about that's not on the level we're talking about here of like the evil of like mass killing or something like that. And, but over the last couple of years, while people were trying to, in like kind of liberal leftisty circles, this is more in like liberal circles, I think leftists were like, kind of, what the hell are you guys doing? But there was this attempt to like understand the Trump voter, and to understand like the economic resentment, or like the feelings of I was always told as a white person and a male and a Christian and a heterosexual and a cisgendered person, like, that the world was supposed to be mine, and now it's not, and I'm upset about that. And, like, I think on some level it is helpful to understand those things. Because it's helpful that, I mean, there are ways in which, you're right, some of the, if you're born into hatred, it's hard to reason your way out of hatred. But at least if we understand where hatred comes from, we can maybe help, like, reach some people, but certainly help other people not be raised in it to begin with.
Yeah.
But I think that a lot of times those articles went to a place of, you know what, so let's have a lot of sympathy for these people, like, who are having to deal with all these things they never expected, of losing their jobs and a black president, and oh, poor them, that their sense of traditional marriage is having to be challenged. I'm like, fuck them. I have so little sympathy for that. And I don't want to turn this into a political rant, although too late. But my point being, I think this is another place where there's just that same attempt of being like, well, there has to be some rational reason why people decide to vote for Trump. There has to be some rational reason why people can be so convinced that these economic policies that are clearly hurting them are actually good for them, or whatever it is. And it's just, sometimes people are just hateful. Mm-hmm. Sometimes, like, racism and sexism and homophobia and transphobia and, like, Christian supremacism and white supremacism, like, those things are real. And I think to me, and maybe I'm kind of like totally misrepresenting what you're saying, but I think I'm in the same path of, like, in the same way, I think sometimes we just have to accept, like, there might not be this, like, rational Magneto Killmonger level, justified reasoning why people find their ways into hateful positions. Hate's just a real thing.
Yeah, for sure. Exactly. And, like, my, Trump supporting former friend, like, there were warning signs all along. Like, he was, like, a big Obama supporter, like, 2008 and then 12. And, like, but there were, when I'd had conversations with him, he talked about his racist father. He talked about his racist friends and, like, the racist shit they would say and kind of laugh about it. And be like, oh, they're so racist, right? But, like, then he had a really unpleasant divorce, and I don't know exactly what happened there, but I know that it left him, that he either it was spurred by or came from a, like deep misogyny. And then as he started, like, I don't know, maybe he just ended up sort of leaning that way in some ways, and some people who were expressing certain misogynistic things said some other racist things that he was like, oh, maybe my dad wasn't wrong. Like, and, and it was just, I saw it. It was like this gradual process, and it was really fucking depressing. Like, seeing someone who seemed like a rational, reasonable person who had actually gone out of their way to try to help people for a while, then just turn and like, just this hard 90-degree right turn, I guess. Yeah. And, and sometimes there's going to be something like that where you're going to see, oh, this is how this person went down this path. Somebody else maybe had another way. And then some people, I know people who just, like, their parents were Republicans, they're Republicans. They're like, okay, I guess this is what Republicans are now. And they just... Right. I don't know. There's no more depth on the political ranting, but the point being, like, when you're talking about a group of people like that, who basically is a group of people who did a thing once or twice, right? Like, it's a group of people. It's tens of millions of people. Different people had different reasons, and you can say, oh, well, economic factors maybe increased the number of people who did this thing. But there were a lot of people who were just like, I don't like these people. I don't like those people. And, like, they're just like, fuck them. And, they pulled a lever. And
I think a lot of it is kind of the story, like you told, of someone who, like, bad things happen to them and then they want someone to blame. Yeah. And that there's a lot of language. And this is something, I mean, this is not unique to the right, but I think at the current moment it's much, much worse on the right, of that kind of reaching out. And pulling it back again to, we actually got a comment about our personal political position.
We should go to that one next.
Sure, we can do that. I was going to say let's take a break from that a bit and talk about a couple other things.
Yeah, whatever.
But kind of pulling it back, I think this kind of gets back to something you were saying at the beginning of this conversation of just, it is helpful. I like the Killmongers. Mm-hmm. I like the the Kingpins. I like the Magnetos. I like the people where it's like, I see why you think you're why you're the hero.
Right.
But it's also true that, like, going so far that we start to think like every bad person in our world must be really sympathetic on some level. If we can only see the world through their perspective, like, no, that's not really true. Sometimes people in power just want to subjugate other people because that's what helps them feel like they're in more power.
Yeah.
And that's true whether it's, as the king of a nation that wants to catch up to, all these other colonizer nations, or just because, you're in danger of losing your job, and so you want to make sure that the people, that there's still someone in the world who you can look down on,
right?
Because of their race or their color or their who they love or what gender they are, or anything.
Yeah,
like that.
Even if you're not any better off for it, it's just yeah.
Definitely. So, Kamal, thank you again so much. It was a great email back and forth we had. And I'm really glad we're going to bring that up.
I don't know how we're going to do a whole episode out of just however many feedback things. We only got a half hour out of that one.
Yeah, I know. Well, this next one I think could be a little quicker, but it's a great point. On a recent episode, I think you were on it, we were kind of joking about how, there's so much destruction that happens in these various worlds. You kind of wonder, like, what are insurance rates like? If a hero moves into your town, like, what's building insurance like? If it's destroyed by Thor, is that an actual act of God?
Right.
And Kevin Warren wrote in, big fan of your podcast and network. In the last superhero ethics episode, the idea of a show where insurance adjusters had to go around after superpowered people demolish buildings was brought up. I'm sure with the audience you have, someone quicker than I has already suggested this show. They haven't, so go you. There's an anime and manga called Trigun, where two of the main characters are just that, insurance adjusters. They're tasked with trying to mitigate the damage caused by a character named Vash the Stampede, or Stampido in the original I'm not sure to say it with that accent. They're tasked with trying to mitigate the damage caused by a character named Vash the Stampede, or Stampido, in the original Japanese. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. I'm not sure how much you care for anime. I seem to remember you saying that you're not a big fan of animation in general, but I'm not 100% true on that. I'm mostly not, but I'm coming around. This show is definitely a hard recommend, though. The first episode leads into the zany harder than the rest of the series, and the show gets its footing an episode or two in, and it's kind of a mix of 70s TV Hulk and Kung Fu. So, awesome. I'm so glad you know that exists, and our list is pretty long, but I'm happy to put that on a list of stuff to watch and some point talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for the recommendation. I will definitely check that out. I actually tried to watch it on some not top line streaming thing. So
okay.
I'm not sure whether that'll pan out. But yeah, I'm looking forward to that. I do enjoy anime a good amount. I kind of paused watching it mostly because I want to learn Japanese first.
That's fair.
And that's the 8th or 9th language on the list. But I actually usually watch in Japanese with English subs, but it would be nice to be able to watch with Japanese subs. But yeah, I definitely look forward to checking that out. One of the funny things during the podcast that we did, I don't think we got into too much. Oh, we did, right? But Steve, who was on the podcast, wrote a series of comics called, I think, Proactive Insurance, The Pros. And it's sort of in this vein a little bit. Not exactly, but kind of. So it was kind of funny that we came up with it. I think I even said it, and then I was like, oh wait, I actually read that comic.
That sounds right. And Steve, by the way, he along with Will Freeland, who's been on a number of our podcasts, they're the two co-hosts of the Hype is My Superpower podcast, which really goes deep in comic books themselves. Definitely recommend, and I'll see if I can find a link to that comic that he created to share. So I think the next one I want to go into, and you referenced this, it's a tweet that I actually just got today by Sam Russell. And Sam wrote, "Hi, love the show. I was wondering, will you ever have someone on to give the conservative or centrist side of superhero ethics?" I have a lot to say in regard to this, but Paul, I want to kind of let you give a first chance to kind of what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, I thought Matthew was the centrist, no? Resident radical anarchist here. But
hey, listen, which one of us has gotten actually literally arrested for doing political things?
Oh,
Thank you very much.
Which one of us has had the police come to their door while on this very podcast talking about whether or not someone should kill the president in a purely fictional...
Which one of us just got mocked for bringing up that story too often? Anyway, we're going way too far here. Okay, so...
You brought it up more first, but okay.
Daredevil shouldn't hit people with iron poles and think he's not killing people.
Right.
Anyway, now we've gotten all the things we bring up too often.
Fantastic. Something about Zack Snyder.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because it's like I think having a wide range of perspectives is valuable and often can kind of push our own views, right? Like being challenged, I think, sometimes it's like, oh, that's a really good point and I hadn't thought about it and I'm going to do some thinking about it and maybe change my viewpoint. And other times it's like, that's an interesting way of attacking my viewpoint or taking a different tack, and I want to reconsider, and no, I definitely disagree with you, and now I have a better way of expressing that, why I think that's not true. So, at the same time, like, if there's a viewpoint that feels very toxic, then it's like, maybe I don't really want to have a conversation with somebody. Mostly personally, like, I really don't want to have a conversation with somebody who doesn't want to have a conversation. Right? Because there is this thing that is quite prevalent on the right. It also exists on the left and in the center of basically stating one's case and then hearing a reaction to that and either totally ignoring that and just restating the case in the first place or misrepresenting the view that the other person was trying to express. And sometimes I think that's legitimate confusion and just poor communication. But very often I think it's kind of a trolly refusal to actually engage someone on the point they're trying to make. And I personally don't really have any interest in partaking in that or listening to it. There's things that I've watched sometimes and I'm like, oh, I kind of like this show, but the host isn't actually responding to their panel, and I'm like, what's the point of that? Why, if they're just going to ignore what's being said, this isn't, there's no point to have a conversation, like just record separate monologues and people can listen to them.
Yeah. I think I'm in a similar place, but I would add a couple of different caveats. One is, you joke about me being a centrist, and it's funny because 5 years ago, I think in a lot of ways, I was kind of more politically leftist than you were in some ways. Although you've always had a strong anarchist streak.
Yes.
And I think it's just kind of adjusted in some ways. And I think there's still some ways in which I think the whole concept of like left, right, center is kind of broken to begin with.
Yes.
But like, you and I sit at different points of axes, and in some places I'd be considered more radical, in some places you'd be considered more radical. And your joke about centrism is also kind of an interesting one. I feel like, we both have kind of a leftist bent, and I think you could say that like I'm the centrist, or that liberals are centrist, but certainly centrist in the modern day political context I think is quite different than that.
Yeah.
I think the Joe Manchins of the world are kind of the centrists of today.
Centrist.
I have a whole. We're not going to just make this a political riff.
No.
But I think there's two other key things, and actually, so
just in
so let me check.
Just in terms of the axes, I do think like left-right economics speaking, like I think we're in pretty similar area. I think anti-authoritarian, like anarchist compared to not like hard authoritarianism, but a little softer. I think we diverge a little bit more. But
yeah, I think that kind of, and it's funny that we keep talking about civil war, but in some ways I feel like civil war encapsulates one of the biggest axes of human discussion and division there is, which is that fundamentally you have more trust in the individual and I have more trust in the society.
Oh, I just have no trust in anyone.
Yeah,
I have more trust in myself.
Fair enough. Anyway, not to get into that, but the other caveat I was going to add to all this is I think we do have. I certainly don't do any kind of political litmus test of who comes on, but I know that we've had people on who share political ideas that I often disagree with a lot. Matt Carroll has been very open about the fact that he's, a libertarian who has voted Republican for quite a lot of his time. He's very opposed to Trump and like that aspect of republicanism, but I think he's a lot closer to the right than you or I on a lot of economic issues and a lot of social justice issues. So I think he's definitely a voice that we've had on here, not all the time, but I think he's guested on 5 or 6 episodes by now. And there's also a couple other people I think have fairly different political views on a number of things, and some of them come up and some of them not. And so we've had definitely guests who are of various political stripes, and I think are, I don't always agree with on everything, and I certainly don't have to. But I think I do have a couple of general guidelines that I follow in terms of who are the people I want to bring on and what are the topics I want us to get into. And one of them is definitely the one that I think, Paul, you were mentioning in terms of like the toxicity and stuff like that. A second is, and it's kind of related to it in terms of the like toxic debating habits, but this can also, it doesn't even have to be that. I think in order to have a discussion, not even a debate, but also debate, but even more discussion, you have to start with agreement on general principles that you can then move forward on.
Yeah.
I can't have someone come on and talk to me about a TV show if they haven't seen the TV show, and the point is to actually discuss the TV show instead of an idea from it. And in my own professional career, I spent a long time working in reproductive justice, pro-choice as some people would understand it. And, one thing I learned is that if someone starts from the viewpoint that life begins at conception, and someone else starts from the viewpoint that it doesn't, I'm in the second camp, there's not much of a discussion to be had between those two. You can have a discussion about, okay, well, if we disagree on that, can at least find ways to agree on, like, are these different things that can help, reduce unwanted pregnancy, if we both agree on that or something like that. But if the core principle is one believes this is when life begins and another believes something different, you're not going to be able to have much of a discussion about, like, the moral value of the thing. Wow, that sounds terrible. Of the moral value of a fetus, or for example. And I'm touching on the abortion argument, not to get into it at all, just to kind of use that as an example of, if someone is interested in coming here to talk about how superhero movies are terrible and there's no point watching them because they don't teach anything, well, the whole premise of superhero ethics is that they do. And so I don't know if I could have a conversation with that person. But the third thing is, and I think this is kind of similar to what you were talking about, Paul, but I want to take it in a bit different direction, is it's not just that I don't want to have toxic conversations, and I don't want to have conversations with people who I think aren't arguing in good faith, though I think that's very true. And I think, as you said, a failure to argue in good faith can happen on all sides of the political spectrum. I certainly think right now it is being driven much more, especially in big media circles, by more on the right, but it can happen on all sides, agreed. But also, and maybe this sounds like the opposite, but I don't think so, there are some topics that I believe are settled, and I'm not interested in re-debating. And I mean things like climate change. Like, I think climate change is real, and if you want to get into, like, the nitty-gritty of, okay, the exact details of how climate's changing and things like that, I'm not a scientist. That's not my place to debate. But if someone were to want to come on and say, well, I want to debate with you if climate change is real because you reference it in regard to Marvel shows, I'm not interested in having that discussion. I'm not interested in having a conversation about if vaccines help or hurt. I think that's settled. And in similar ways, I'm not interested in having discussions about, is white supremacy a thing? Is misogyny in comic book worlds a thing?
Right. Or, is it good?
Yeah, or, is representation in general a good thing? I'm not interested in having that conversation. And it's not that I think that conversation should never happen, because I do think it is a settled topic, but I think that it's helpful for more people to hear the reasoning. But that's not what this podcast is for. This podcast is like, okay, we're talking to folks who agree with some of these general ideas. Let's dive into them and talk about how can we explore these kind of things, and how can we find the things that are our own blind spots, like me with colonialism, or the things that we can hear by listening to other people's voices. And I just think that on those topics especially, I believe that they're settled, and I believe that continuing to discuss them again and again and again, and giving someone on quote unquote the other side a platform as though that there is a reasonable discussion to be had about, well, maybe white supremacy doesn't exist, or maybe there isn't misogyny in comic book movies or in Hollywood. Like, I just, that's not what this is a platform for. And so for me, that's kind of where I stand. And I'll say kind of to wrap it up, I would have said 10 years ago that there were many conservatives who I would happily have on here to have a great conversation about the topics we talk about. I feel like that the way the country has changed, especially the way that the political party that kind of represents conservatism to some extent, the Republicans, has changed, means that it's honestly a lot harder for me to conceptualize of conservatives who are going to want those conversations on the kind of terms that I'm interested in having them. I would love to be proven wrong. If there are folks who identify as conservative or centrist who are fans of this podcast, please let me know. I'd love to, if you want to talk about, ways that Batman could use his money better to make the populations of Gotham better, I'd be happy to have those conversations. If you want to talk about, like, you know, Captain America, the American patriotism and stuff like that, I'd be happy to talk about those conversations. But to give just an example, like the last time folks who are identifying as conservative came into these kind of conversations that I was a part of, not on this podcast, but on the Stranded Panda Facebook group, it was from the perspective of, oh, John Walker is misunderstood. There's no racism. You know, there was nothing. The banker didn't do anything racist in Falcon and the Winter Soldier. The cops didn't do anything racist. And I have trouble believing that those arguments are being made in good faith. But even if they are, I just don't think there's any value in having those arguments, not on this podcast at least.
Yeah, I think that's fair. You know, I think those are arguments that, like, need to happen for some people with the right people.
Right.
And I think that, you know, there are things that we can discuss here that, you know, maybe I feel like often are kind of more nuances in an area where we're a little closer together a lot of the times. Mm-hmm. And having someone a little further apart on some issues, I think, can be fantastic. On issues like whether or not there's racism, whether or not it was displayed in Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and, like, you know, whether or not it should even exist in comic book, you know, media, I right. think that's maybe not the conversation to have.
Yeah. Like, I'll give an example. I think if someone wanted to come on and tell me that they actually are even more of a Kingpin fan than I am because they're super pro-gentrification, okay, let's have that conversation. I'd be interested in having that conversation. If someone wants to come on and say, like, well, the Viltrumites, Omni-Man's people, are actually super powerful, and so they should be the ones ruling everything. Like, that's not something I think is up for debate, you know?
Right. Fair. And similarly, I think, like, if somebody wants to come on, I don't know, maybe me, and say, like, yeah, I love superhero movies, but, like, I do think they're fairly problematic. You know, mm-hmm. I think there's a lot of issues in superhero movies, and I think we have a real problem with superhero movies dominating visual fiction to the extent that they do, and particularly being controlled by such a small number of companies. I mean, I saw somewhere a rumor that, like, Disney was going to buy DC, and I'm like, oh, please no. You know, I mean, on the one hand, like, yeah, I think, you know, Marvel Studios has done a much better job with their, you know, live action offerings than DC has of late. But at the same time, it's like having things consolidated more does not seem like a good idea to me. But, like, that's a conversation we can have, not saying, like, oh, these are all garbage and they should not exist. But, like, I think a lot of times when we say, okay, we appreciate this thing, but let's talk about it and talk about some of the things that maybe could be different, either in that thing or in overall society, and then that thing wouldn't maybe have some of the negative effects maybe it does.
Definitely. Yeah, and that's right. I mean, I think there's definitely people out there who I think are going to be much more critical than we are. Our mutual friend Logan, the person who knew us both in high school and introduced us, is, I think, in many ways a lot more radical than I am. And I think in some ways more radical than you are, though not all. And we've had him on this podcast before, and I'll happily have him on again. I'll happily have people on from all sorts of perspectives. I want conversations.
Yeah.
I want people to disagree, but be interested in those conversations. And if that's where they're coming from, that's what's more interesting to me than, like, the label they use.
Logan's the one I was speaking to, and the Congo came up, or Leopold. Yeah. That was one of the things, and then the Chomsky video was the other one.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because I think if you were to say to me, like, I think there are some people, and, like, Logan's made this point, as others have, that, like, on some level maybe we shouldn't be consuming any of this media,
right?
You know? And I think I think to me, I think it's valuable to consume it because it's part of the pop culture discussion, and I think we can get a lot out of it. But I think if someone were to look at it and go, Matthew, you only do this podcast, so you have a reason to justify sitting and eating popcorn while watching, you know, Thor and Captain America blow things up.
Right.
Yeah, you might have a point there too.
Yeah, I mean, I think with a lot of things, I think we have to look at it and say, look, there's negative value and there's positive value, right? There is harm that's done and there's good that's done as well, right? People feeling represented in ways that they didn't before. You know, and some subjects being broached that might not have been broached in certain groups, right? I mean, I have a lot of issues with how Falcon and the Winter Soldier ended in certain regards, but in terms of being like, yeah, this show is going to be about how there's going to be a black Captain America, and you're all going to deal with it and talk about it. Like, I think that has a net positive effect on society, even if there is an extent to which I think the show is centrist propaganda. But
and I would say it's liberal propaganda,
fair.
But I think that's also because our views of that scale differ a bit. But I agree. And I think it was nowhere near as radical as a show that I would have wanted. Mm-hmm. But I also know, and I think it's kind of what you're saying, there are people I know who have had their attitudes on race changed by that show who would never watch Noam Chomsky or never listen to Noam Chomsky.
Exactly.
I think that's why the value. So anyway, let's move on because unsurprisingly, we're finding a lot to talk about these things. TJ Strafford, who's written in a bunch of times, is very involved in the Panda Network. Thank you so much, TJ, for being a loyal fan and for writing in. I've spent the last couple of months listening to many of your older casts, and there's one that hit me really hard. I'm talking about episode 94, link in the show notes, No Racism in Ba Sing Se. The reason this one specifically strikes a chord with me is because I live in Ba Sing Se. And for those who don't know what we're talking about, in the show Avatar: The Last Airbender, again, spoilers for this if you want to jump ahead, in the city of Ba Sing Se, the Earth Kingdom in which the city is a capital of is in the midst of a terrible war, and all these horrible things are happening, but the people are pretty much brainwashed, and the sort of the thing they keep repeating is there is no war in Ba Sing Se. And the episode was about how that's kind of an idea of like the ways in which we can blind ourselves to hard truths that we don't want to acknowledge. So with that being said, TJ continues, here's what I mean. I live in northern New York, very northern, basically Canadian minus the free healthcare, in a very small town surrounded by several other small towns. My community looks, and a lot of times acts, like one giant Trump rally. There isn't much diversity here. There were only 2 black students that I can think of in my high school, and they were brothers. For the most part, if you encounter a person of color around here, they're either a student or an employee of one of the 4 universities in the area. Because of these factors, I essentially live in a bubble. So in a way, so many of the racial issues our country deals with almost feel like they're happening on another planet. It all feels so foreign to me, it's almost incomprehensible. To top things off, I'm having to confront the idea that I've always held about law enforcement. I grew up watching cop shows and always held the profession in high regard. My community has very similar views. Because of this, I studied criminal investigation in college. Due to health concerns, I was never able to become a police officer, but I do work security at one of the local colleges. So that is sort of law enforcement adjacent. He puts in a question mark. Regardless, my job requires me to work with local police fairly regularly. I know all the officers in my local department, so it's extremely difficult to reconcile my experiences with the rest of our countries. I've come to the conclusion that in a way, I live in a reality separate from the rest of the world. This is what I mean when I say that I live in Ba Sing Se. We don't have giant walls separating us, but our distance from major cities, combined with our frankly obscenely cold winters, which here in Minnesota I have no idea what you're talking about, keeps most from coming to our area. As a result, there's never much change here. Most people are content to ignore the problem since they rarely reach us. Anyway, sorry for the dissertation. Nothing to be sorry for. So glad you wrote in. Just wanted to say thanks for framing this in a way that I can relate to and therefore discuss. I'm loving your cast and making the night shifts go by myself. I'm loving your cast and it's making the night shifts by myself go by a lot faster. Keep doing what you're doing. So, Paul's always want to hear your thoughts, but I just want to start by saying, TJ, thank you so much for writing in. And this, I picked it to go next, but I think it's kind of so perfect after the discussion we just had. To me, that's the kind of perspective that I'm so glad to hear because, honestly, I can't claim to know. I did grow up in a very liberal bubble, very different than what TJ is talking about. And sometimes it's easy for me to just say, I think even here we've kind of, before I was like, fuck all those people who are racist and homophobic and don't want to change. And I do still feel that way to some extent. But I think what TJ is really helping to point out is like, but that doesn't mean all those people. Like, there are people who can grow up in one perspective and see things differently because things are pointed out to them. And that's true on all dynamics, right or left center. So, I just love this email so much. And I think you really captured what makes that episode about Ba Sing Se so powerful and so relatable. Paul, what's your thought on this?
First of all, thank you again, TJ, for sending this in. It really is it's funny because this this message is about kind of us talking about something and that being something that you're unfamiliar with and kind of getting a view of what that's like, what it's like to live kind of in the rest of the world to some extent, right? And meanwhile, it's giving us a look into what it's like maybe to live in northern New York, practically Canada, which I've thought about moving to like way north New York or Vermont, basically so I could just like make it off across the border when inevitably American empire crumbles. And ideally, I'd like to move to Canada sooner. But no, I mean, just the idea that like there are places where certain problems, not that they don't touch, but that they barely touch, right? Like, if you live in a place that has almost no black people, then the police probably aren't going to engage in as much violence towards black people.
Right. Because
there's just not as much opportunity. I read somewhere recently that the city, I think, with the highest rate of incidents of like anti-Asian hate crimes is Vancouver. And at first that's like, oh, but it's a city that's like half like Asian or like half Asian Canadian. And it's like, but of course, right? Like you're obviously going to have a lot more of a particular conflict if you have more people of the groups who are going to engage in that conflict in that case. And as with law enforcement, against, black civilians, like that's a very one-sided conflict most of the time. But I think, the fact that like we can kind of bring ideas to one another through the internet is a magical thing, and it makes me happy even when the ideas are sometimes about like really fucking awful, depressing shit.
No, I think it's helpful because even as much as I say it, like it is easy for me to start thinking in terms of like all those people in flyover country and that kind of nonsense. And I think I still probably hold more of those views than I would like to.
Right.
I think I held far more of them 5 years ago and certainly 15 years ago. And I think messages like this are super helpful because I think it helps remind us that, like we had this great conversation about how there's some people who just, they want to hold on to this hate and they want to hold on to this supremacy because that's all they know. But also I think, as TJ's pointing out, sometimes it's also because you just haven't been exposed to anything else. And to me, I mean, again, what kind of a better way of, pointing these things out of like, TJ, I think you've kind of had your own kind of coming to understanding these things from many directions, but for folks in communities where they're never going to watch something about like a Noam Chomsky or I want to list a
like the Fred Hampton movie, right? Recently, Judas and the Black Messiah.
But because I think it's certainly true that, someone who's not going to watch the Judas and the Black Messiah or the Malcolm X movie, but will watch Falcon and the Winter Soldier, or will watch, Avatar: The Last Airbender, a kid's show. But that is so insidious because it's got such strong political messages that can hit people, and it still is also wonderfully entertaining. Even though I think the first season's a little more kid-friendly than I would like, but that's just because I'm a grumpy old man.
And I'd like to also at some point perhaps do an episode about some things that are problematic in the series that looking back it's like, oh, they could have done better with that. Despite the fact that it's like my favorite series ever.
So I don't know if there's much more to say about it. I would just say like I think that's such a great point. I think you've highlighted an aspect to the Ba Sing Se story that Kamal earlier talked about how he sees the colonialism issue as a black man in a way that I can never claim to see. And I'm so glad for that perspective. I've never in a million years been worried that I was actually myself living in Ba Sing Se. I mean, I think America is, but I never felt like I didn't feel like I had to have my eyes opened to a moment that I wasn't, that I was living in Ba Sing Se and I shouldn't. In the way, TJ, I think what you're talking about, I think it's just such a great perspective. And I love that. I'm just so glad you wrote in about it. So thank you so much. Give you a chance in case you have anything else, then I'll just move on.
Oh, I also wanted to say thanks to Kamal for the Invincible question or comment, and thanks to Sam for the tweet, and thanks to Kevin for the recommendation. I think I gave thanks for the recommendation, but I just realized as I was thanking one person specifically, which I is genuine, I also feel genuine appreciation for the other messages that we have received as well, and I wanted to explicitly express that.
No, I think that's really true. I think to everyone, well, with one exception that I'm about to get to, but to everybody who wrote into us, thank you so much. We're so grateful. I think it makes this episode possible. We talked about that at the beginning, and if I'm not personally thanking each of you, thank you so much. One exception, our email, yeah. We did an episode last week that I've jokingly referred to as Thirsty Pandas, about thirst, ethics of thirst. Some dude named Paul who's just never happy with anything.
Never happy with anything.
He thinks he's a radical, but really not so much. He wrote in, I enjoyed your thirst episode with Ashley Coffin, despite the fact that the usage of the word thirst in this context seems redundant with the word horny and also renders me without a neutral means of expressing a literal need for increased hydration. Hold on, I'm going to have a sip. Anyway, I think it's so important that women and queer folks feel comfortable to express their sexual desires and attractions and all that. And I think Ashley and others have done a great job carving out a safe space for this. And I think you, Matthew, thank you, have done great work helping male and non-binary folks feel comfortable expressing appreciation for and or attraction to other male and non-binary folks. I do think that while you mention the potential for harm in the prevalence of such idealized images of the male form, and rightly pointed out that many body types can be attractive, you undersold it a bit more than I'd like. Of course, women have been treated worse by Hollywood for far longer, and there's an extent to which turnabout is fair play, and I certainly don't want to shame anyone for their desires or for expressing those desires. I think it's great that more people are feeling comfortable expressing themselves, as there has been discussing repression of female sexuality, homosexuality, and all forms of queerness for literal millennia. I just want to shine a bit brighter light on the damage done by the industry to people of all genders and orientations. So, obviously, I'm talking about our own Paul here. Thank you so much for writing this all down. He didn't actually write it in, but he listened to that episode and had some good thoughts and wrote it down so we could talk about it here on the feedback. So, Paul, I was about to give
ask
my
me
response.
to respond to my. I don't know. This guy sounds like a dick. I don't know.
Yeah, fair enough. I would just say I think you made a really good point there. I think, especially on that episode, there was so much we were trying to get into that I think for myself especially, because we're kind of we're sort of fighting back against so many, as you point out, literal millennia of men saying, like, we get to talk about, like, oh yeah, look at her butt, look at her breasts, you know, right, whatever. But that women are not supposed to. And the episode was all about kind of like reclaiming that space and Ashley getting to talk about why that's so important and me kind of cheering that on and giving some perspective. I didn't want to kind of make it too much about, like, but what about the men? Think about the poor men.
Right.
But I think you are correct that I think that we probably maybe should have gone into that a little bit more, because I do think that there's, and I think as you point out in this email as well, and we said in the podcast, there is an entire culture that's built around telling women that unless they are this particular body type, that they are worthless and terrible and they can never get a mate, or they shouldn't go out in public, or they shouldn't wear a bikini. That I think and I think many people who are masculine identified in some way or another are just not subjected to in anywhere near the same way. But that's not an absolute. And I think you're very right that there's definitely a sense of which the things that Chris Evans and Sebastian Stan, not Stan Sebastian, as some idiotic co-host may have mentioned in the past, you know, the things that these folks are doing to themselves is not healthy. And them being held up as I think for the most part, we're not necessarily holding them up as like, why can't all more men be like this?
Sure, yeah.
But certainly there's that potential, and that's something to definitely be aware of, I think. And I think you're very right to kind of highlight that further.
Yeah, and what I left out here that I want to add is that I do think it's a very difficult topic. I think it's a very important topic in terms of, you know, people embracing their sexuality, particularly people who have not been encouraged to do so, you know. Yeah. And I mean, you talk during the thing about like the ways in which men have often done this, and personally, I've always found men or boys, or anyone, but like especially like men and boys around me talking about women in those ways, it's made me uncomfortable. You know, it particularly like when it's like particularly misogynistic. Like it's not. I haven't always spoken out about it, or I've like maybe almost never spoken out about it, and I think that's bad, and I wish I would have more. And in the future, but at the same time, like the whole thing, like, oh, that's just locker room talk, you know, like that specific quote to which, you know, was referred. I was like, I haven't really heard people talk like that around me, you know, and I feel like certain people talk in certain ways more around people they think are going to be okay with it. You know, and like maybe I give off like a sort of like disapproving of sexual assault vibe. I don't know.
Yeah.
And like I would like to give off that vibe, but yeah, I do think that men have body issues, body image issues too, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of issues that affect women or affect racial minorities that also affect people who aren't in those minorities, and I think I appreciate that you did mention it, and I don't want to like derail the conversation,
Yeah.
I just kind of want to like sort of like add a little kind of chaser, like, by the way, there's also some stuff like this going on, and I think that's maybe like a longer conversation for another time, but I did think that you did a really good job of trying to kind of make sure that you had like kind of some disclaimers throughout, like, these aren't the only bodies that like,
Right.
people find attractive, and, it's not like you're necessarily better because, you spend 8 months getting jacked.
Right. And I think those are very good points. And I think you're right that this episode wasn't necessarily the right time for it. But I think one thing that this really crystallizes for me, an episode that I've wanted us to do for a while, and that I think this would be not the only, but kind of one interesting point about it, is like getting into images of masculinity that superhero movies give us, both in terms of toxic images that are given, or sometimes challenging toxic images, body images, like ideas of how men are supposed to carry themselves in the world. I think there's a great topic to be discussed there. And in that we can get into everything from, superheroes type stuff to the body image to, and even the Disney movies Frozen and Frozen 2, where I think the character of Kristoff, especially in the song he sings in the second movie, but just his whole character is just such a great like response to a hero who does not embody toxic masculinity and very specifically rejects it in a great way. So there's so much we could talk about there, but I think this issue of body image would be a great one to talk about, because I think, it does feel different to me than as Ashley and I talked about on that issue, like someone like Chris Pratt has to change their body fairly significantly in order to be part of a Marvel movie. But Chris Pratt could also be a huge star in Parks and Rec and be thought of as, very attractive and very charming while not having anything close to a Marvel body in a way that I think would be much harder for someone who wasn't a masculine actor. So, yeah, I think there's so many dynamics to talk about there. And I think I think you kind of said it well, that we don't need to put it as part of the but actually part of a conversation about, emerging thirst, female and queer thirst. But it is a topic we should definitely get into, and so let's plan on that episode sometime in the future.
Sounds good.
Awesome. So we have two more. First comes from Jenny Huang, and Jenny wrote in, I just heard the last podcast, and I apologize. This people are sending me messages in a number of ways. One thing that sometimes people are doing is going to the Facebook pages of the Superhero Ethics or the Star Wars Ethic or the Star Wars podcast page and sending me like a Facebook message through those. Thank you for doing so. It's hard for me to find those sometimes, both because the Ethical Panda is kind of the main page I'm trying to use, but also just because Facebook is garbage, and it's hard to get direct messages sent by people who aren't on my friends list, and they're sent to one of those two a group instead of just my own profile. So if you can, I apologize. I haven't gotten it until now. It's always better to just email us at theethicalpanda@gmail.com or leave a public comment on the Ethical Panda Facebook page or Twitter. But these are also other good ways to reach us, and I apologize I didn't get to it earlier. But so she wrote, I believe right after the episode we did on Godzilla vs. Kong, I just heard the last podcast. It was interesting and entertaining as usual. Good to hear that. To add to the category of large animals, I was wondering why you did not mention Jurassic Park or Planet of the Apes. I think the T-Rex would fall into the category of titans, and just like King Kong, the chimpanzees of Planet of the Apes are very intellectual. Also, are very intellectual. And then also in a different message, Jenny mentioned that they are blind and that they really loved our discussion of Daredevil. So first of all, thank you so much for that. I'd asked people who had vision impairments of various kinds to reach out to that because I was acknowledged I was speaking from a kind of disabled perspective, but not a blindness perspective. So thank you so much, Jenny, for that. But Paul, what's kind of your thoughts on how does Jurassic Park and T-Rex and Planet of the Apes fall in our larger conversation about titans and big monsters and things like that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think those are great examples that you brought up, Jenny. I was mostly just focusing on, the Titanverse or the Monsterverse or whatever, they call it. In terms of other stuff, I guess I probably referenced Star Wars a little bit too, knowing me. I didn't re-listen to the episode, but yeah, I mean, the dinosaurs that actually walked this earth were, huge animals, right?
Yeah.
And very real. And I do think, to some extent, I think the Titans are kind of modeled after them, right? And Planet of the Apes I found very interesting. The newer ones, especially the first one, I guess, of the newer ones. And I haven't seen it that recently, but, Caesar's just straight up a person, right? And, I mean, but, chimpanzees and great apes, are, to me, are people. And, I mean, all animals are people to some extent to me, right? When we were talking about things where, you might just not see eye to eye with someone, like you were talking about, you can't talk about reproductive rights if, in the same way, if one person's like, well, I think, this zygote is life and someone else is, to me, animal lives are lives that matter, and to some people not so much, and then some people are like, well, they are, but maybe a lot less than humans, and so yeah, I mean, I think these are really good examples. I don't know why they didn't spring to mind. I don't know, I was probably really tired that day also, but like usual. Yeah, I think the apes in Planet of the Apes, it's particularly interesting because they get, a higher level of intelligence than they already have, which is already a very high level of intelligence, right? And, the sort of what would happen between animals and humans if animals had a little bit more power. I think it's a very interesting question. Yeah. And, I don't know, maybe humans would get what they deserve.
Yeah. I mean, I think those are both great examples, and I'm really glad, Jenny, you brought them up. Let me start with just the Planet of the Apes one that you were just discussing. And granted, I haven't seen these movies in a number of years. I think I last saw... I think I saw the second one. I never actually got to see the third one. And I saw the second one when it came out, which I think is at least 5 years ago by now. So my memory might be hazy. But one of the things that I always got the feeling of is, yes, their intelligence increased, but much more so, their ability to communicate with humans and to express their intelligence in ways that humans would recognize was a big part of what changed. And I think that's a big part of the most important part of the movie, to be honest. And the whole idea is kind of pointing out, and this is something that I think I love, kind of give a shout out to Matt Carroll. Star Trek, I think, does such a good job of highlighting this again and again and again, that when we understand intelligence and sentience and thus moral value in one specific set of terms, anything that doesn't fit that small box we think of as not intelligent and not sentient and thus not worthy of the same kind of moral value. And I think Planet of the Apes is a great example of that. And so I think it's another great point to add in this conversation of animal stuff, of how is it that when in these kind of movies and in our own life, when we're encountering things that are different from us, and that's everything from animals to, people with backgrounds and experiences that are different than us. It's so easy for us to say, oh, that person doesn't use the particular kind of grammar that I grew up learning, so they must be stupid. They don't know how to speak proper English, even though, different dialects, whether it's, African-American vernacular English or just, regional dialects or whatever, can have just as much syntax and grammar and, grammatical rules as the Queen's English. It's just not what we're taught to, see as intelligent or that kind of thing. So,
yeah.
No, go ahead. Yeah, I was about to go to Jurassic Park, so you jump in with this one.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point about basically the ability to communicate in a way that more humans will understand. And I mean, for this reason, I think people with accents that are that are foreign to a person, whether they are from speaking English as a second language or, I think personally, like if I examine my own prejudices, like when someone speaks with a Southern accent, I probably that influences my view of them, probably in a negative way. And that's not fair. And, there's some other American accents that I hear and I'm like, but like, and that's also not fair. That's a bias. Personally, I've heard so many people in my life speak with accents that are from speaking English as a second language that I think I have a very different view on that than like your average, right. English speaker does. And similarly with animals, like I've talked to animals since I was a small child, like, and like I look in a cat's eyes and I see a person there and I communicate generally more non-verbally, but like, holding out a hand and they smell my hand and then, maybe I pet them if they want me to. And if they don't, then I leave them alone. And like, I learned that as a very small child. And so I think as a result, I've had a personal connection to animals and have been able to understand them in a way that I think most people feel like this is, there was an idea of animals as like automatons that are basically like robots, essentially like biological robots. Right. And, if they could say words, it would be different, but like most people, I think, don't have that experience to the same extent. I mean, some people do with cats and dogs maybe, but yeah, I think the perception of the intelligence of the, the animals in Planet of the Apes is, bigger than necessarily the actual intelligence in terms of ability to think about things.
Right. I mean, like one thing I'm really struck by is when I was growing up, we were basically taught that sentience and intelligence was basically directly linked to how close an animal was to humanity, Right. And so chimpanzees and apes and others of the kind of collected, like, I want to say monkey, but I know that's not biologically accurate, but like of that kind of general genus, that's probably also not biologically accurate, but whatever. That those were kind of the most intelligent, and that dolphins were kind of put there as well. But, the general is certainly like mammals are the most intelligent. More recently, we're learning that like octopuses, maybe some of the most intelligent creatures on Earth, but like they seem so alien and different and like I've actually seen it, like people claiming like aliens are proof, like octopuses are proof that like alien life exists and they came and populated this planet. I have no idea if there's any validity to any of that. I don't know anything about I'm not a marine biologist by any means, but yeah, I think these are all things that are challenging, our understandings of things. And I think that's very true of animals, but also, as you said, it's true about people who just don't communicate the way we communicate. One of the reasons why I love the TV show Kim's Convenience is it helped me kind of identify some of the biases that I have about the kind of very thick Korean accent that Appo, one of the main characters in that show, has. Not even that I ever would have doubts about his intelligence, but just there are topics he talks about that I found myself being like, oh, I wouldn't think of someone having that accent talking about this topic. What the hell's wrong with me? Why wouldn't I? Of course they would. And it was just such a that's an amazing show itself. That we'll definitely get into.
I just watched the last episode this morning. I'm so sad.
So the last thing I would say though is just on the other part of it. I think you make a great point. Tyrannosaurus Rex is very much a Titan in the same kind of way. I think a little bit different because one of the questions is sort of, were the Titans like a natural part of our world, or are they kind of like something outside of that? And again, all these kind of supernaturally kind of questions. And we just know, I mean, dinosaurs were just a legit part of our world, just eons and eons and eons ago. But I will say, not all of them, and there's been a lot of Jurassic Park movies, and they're really up and down in terms of quality, and I haven't seen every single one of them. But I'd say certainly the first one, and I think for the most part over the series, they do a good job of making it clear that dinosaurs are not evil, that dinosaurs are not monstrous, that they're not, monsters, that they're animals doing things that animals do that aren't in any way like prepared and to live among the human world, and that putting them among the human world is going to be incredibly dangerous for humans. Right. But that like velociraptors aren't evil. They're just hunters. Hungry. That's what they do. Yeah, and so I really
and very
like that.
Smart too. Actually, they're pointed out as being very smart. I think.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. So just all kind of awesomeness there.
I don't think I've actually seen a whole Jurassic Park movie. I think that just occurred to me.
Oh, that's fair.
I've seen most of the first one. Like,
I think a lot of the first one you'd love. I also think that it's a lot about killing animals in ways that you would utterly hate.
Yeah.
So the last one, there's kind of a funny story with this. I think we've mentioned a couple times how much we like the TV show Warrior. We did an episode actually about the Warrior and the idea of the mafia. That's one of maybe 3 episodes about the TV show Warrior that we've wanted to do for a while. And the first one actually came up, I think, I don't remember if this email was the reason you decided to watch Warrior or... No, okay, I think you that's it.
I posted about it, and then I think that's when we were talking about going to do an episode, I think, and then this came from that.
Right. And so one of our listeners wrote in with a really great question about the TV show Warrior. And we were thinking about how to address it, and we decided to actually record a whole episode on in the TV show Warrior, this concept of borders and and nationalities and all kind of things like that, and basing it off of Warrior and then connecting it to other things. And I feel like we never really felt like we got our arms around that episode in the way we wanted to. It didn't really... I sort of felt like in some ways I wasn't the best placed to be talking about that experience, especially because so much is a show about Asian American experience. But also I just feel like there's a number of ways in which it didn't do quite what we wanted to. Which was too bad, because at the end of it, we did get into a long response to this person's email, which was, I think, really powerful and emotional. And, I didn't want to just like cut and paste that. So I want to give us another chance to respond to this email. And I keep not saying that person's name because it's Kamal Moisey, the person who wrote the first email about colonization. So Kamal, you're definitely winning our award this week for best listener feedback. Not even best, but most. Yeah, most.
Most quality entries into the listener feedback arena.
Exactly. I love all the stuff people are sending in. Thank you all so much for it. But Kamal, I just want to point out, like, there's 2 really great thought-provoking things you sent in. So please keep listening and please keep poking at us. Although I'll warn you, you keep sending in really well-rationed thoughts like this, I'm going to have to invite you on as a guest at some point soon. So be careful. So, and I think to start with this, we have to really kind of frame it in the conversation about the TV show Warrior. So again, this is going to have massive spoilers. We're going to spoil a major event that happens towards the end of season 2. That's, I think, kind of a defining moment in the plot of the whole show, but especially of season 2. And basically the whole show has been about the tensions between the the Chinese community in America. I don't really know if we can even call them Chinese Americans yet, because
America wasn't calling them that. But
exactly, yeah. The white community is very much based on, like, send them home. They're not real Americans. They shouldn't be here, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a lot of tension that's been building and some small fights happening. The white community, the racists, are really kind of gaining a lot of power and, like, stirring up the mob. And
the mostly Irish mob, who are workers for... the rich industrialists, basically, and politicians.
Right, exactly. And there's some great conversation in the show about how the Irish themselves are immigrants coming from an awful situation where they were treated terribly by the English, and the potato famine genocide and things like that. But then they come here, and the Irish are now being horrible to the Chinese. And the show, I think, does an interesting job of showing that connection without ever making it like, oh, the Irish were, like, oppressed by the English, so that makes it okay. Like, the Irish are clearly the villains of this situation.
Yeah.
And in the scene that happens, one of the characters who we've gotten to know, Jacob, he's a Chinese person, but who kind of, like, is able to go between both worlds because he's the assistant to one of the white characters we know, and so he kind of spends time in both those worlds, and he's just really a wonderful character. And there's no other way to put it. He literally gets lynched. He gets... attacked and, by a mob. They think that he might be guilty of something, but they're pretty much just, like, grabbing any Chinese person who looks like they're suspicious. Actually, no, I'm getting the details wrong. He's arrested by the police, and but it's on kind of, like, trumped up charges. The police really probably don't have the right man. They're not sure, but the white crowd comes around. Especially because the courts have recently, like, been a little bit sympathetic to the Chinese people, and the crowd again, exactly the way often happened at lynchings, basically demands and fights the police to step back, let the crowd in, to drag him out of the police car and hang him. I think I know you were trying to interrupt at one point. I was kind of on a roll, but any major details I missed there?
Yeah, so I guess spoilers, right? Full spoilers for what's going on. He kills the mayor. He doesn't murder the mayor. The mayor is attempting to kill the mayor's wife, who Jacob works for. And so in defense of her, he hits the mayor over the head with like a fire poker or something, and the mayor dies. So he kills him, not murder, right? Defense. Then he runs away. He gets captured by the police, and then the Irish mob is like, no, hand him over to us. And they're like, well, we've arrested him. And they're like, no, hand him over to us. And they actually, the Irish mob and the police get in a fight, but the police don't use their guns because they're like, they literally say, I think, no need to kill any of our own or something like that. And then the mob wins because they're a mob of a lot of people. And then they lynch Jacob. Yeah. In very graphic fashion.
Yeah. And I think that's a big part of what this email is about. So let me get to the email.
Yeah.
So Kamal writes, so we get to the point where a white mob hangs a quote-unquote guilty Asian man and a riot ensues. Glossing over how the elites pit the poors against each other for profit, which is another really important part of the show, and how I have no idea how to phrase this as a question. As a martial arts fan, I recommended this show to two of my friends. I'm black, one of my friends is black, and the other is from Hong Kong. My black friend and I had a much more visceral reaction to the hanging than my Asian friend did. Granted, no one's a monolith, and people have different tolerances and empathies, etc. Can you talk about how that part of the storyline affected you, if at all? So, I really love this email. I think this is, I think, Kamal, you're highlighting, kind of as you did with the other thing, like the ways in which these stories hit people from very different perspectives, because I had a very visceral reaction to it. I was horrified by it. I was upset by it. I've never had to think that I was going to be lynched. I have never had a thought that, someone like me is going to be attacked because of, the color of my skin. My sexuality and my gender orientation is there's some of that, to be sure, especially now that I've started wearing like nail polish more often and makeup more often. Like I've had times where I've been in gas stations in rural America, and I've definitely felt nervous. And I've thought in those moments of like gay bashing attacks and stuff have definitely come to me. But I don't think I have any kind of the visceral experience on that level. Though I certainly had an incredibly visceral experience to it, and I was very upset by it, ways I think we'll talk about. But I think there are definitely, I think, ways in which it didn't hit me in ways that I can very much understand why it would hit someone, either a black person or someone from Hong Kong or the like. Paul, I know that you also had you're closer to some of these issues in a lot of ways. What was your reaction to that scene?
It was hard to watch. Yeah. Like it. I had I think visceral is a good word for it. Mm-hmm. Like different people respond to different things in fiction differently. I had, throughout that whole sort of coming to that point, I felt like that was just definitely what was going to happen. I felt like they were going to find him guilty anyway and then hang him. But, seeing that, it did have, resonance in terms of thinking about, similar murders of especially of black people in the South, but even in the last number of years, there've been incidents. There've been murders. Yeah. I hate euphemism, and I feel that, it struck me kind of the comparisons, right? And I guess I didn't see myself there, but like I saw my family, know, and, in terms of like what's going on in the world right now, like I saw this during, there had been just a number of attacks on Asian Americans in San Francisco and Oakland. And my wife is Chinese American, her family's Chinese American. And, actually this morning I was watching something that had a picture of a Chinese woman in like 1882 when the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed.
Mm-hmm.
And she looks so much like my wife's grandmother. Like,
Ooh.
there's this picture that she has that, and I was just like, wow. And the people that came over then were mostly from Toisan, which is where she comes from. And so, like, you know, a lot of times, I see things and people say, oh, well, you can't really relate to something if you don't have kind of a personal stake in it. And like, deaths in fiction actually affect me very strongly in general. Like,
right.
I rage quit shows all the time because I'm just like, nope. Yeah. You know,
I rage quit the show after that moment until you
right.
and I talked more, and you like kind of convinced me to watch the rest of the episode in the last episode.
Yeah, and like with this show, I do have a lot of feelings of like there's so much racism, so much racist violence, so much racist language in it, as well as, you know, your 1800s share of misogyny as well. That it's hard to watch, and I could understand that there might be people who are like, yeah, that's just like, that's not what I want to watch. Like, yeah. I watched it alone, you know, because I told Lee, I was like, look, like, they say a lot of words a lot of times, and, you know, there's a lot of racist violence, and like, you should know that. Yeah. If you want to watch this, right, that's going to be there. And she's like, I don't think right now, you know, yeah. Like, where we worry about taking her mom into the city because, like, people are being attacked, you know? Mm-hmm. And even if, like, statistically, yeah, it's probably not that likely, like, any given individual. But it's like, I do feel like it probably affects me differently because I see my family in it, you know? Mm-hmm. Whereas if it were someone whose story didn't feel as directly connected, maybe it wouldn't resonate to the same extent. I don't know. But again, it's like, that's just personal, right? Like, you never know how a particular thing is going to affect a particular person. And I'm getting somewhat choked up now, but not as much as the first time we recorded this.
Yeah, I think you and I were both in tears by the end of the time we talked about it.
For sure. Like, we had like there was like 5 to 10 minutes when I was just like, I'm not going to be able to say anything coherent right now. Yeah. But yeah, it's just like seeing something like that, and to me it was so powerful because it was real, you know? It's like, this exact incident didn't happen, but this kind of thing happened all the time in that time period, and that's a time period that we don't have a lot of access to in fiction, and maybe that's a weird way to put it, but like, I feel like there's a lot of periods of time that we can kind of see on the screen and be like, oh, that's kind of what it was like then, and maybe some of them are shitty depictions that aren't at all realistic, and like, this is a very stylized, you know, kind of kung fu epic, you know, it's got a little bit of a sort of a legendary feel to it, as opposed to just like pure gritty realness. Right. But like, I don't know. I didn't know as much about like the Page Act and the, you know, the Chinese Exclusion Act and all these things before watching the series, and it got me to, and I think that's good. I think seeing something and being affected by it and thus giving more thought to something, you know, horrible from history, but then thinking about the present and see, I don't know, I guess just seeing the present is pretty fucking horrible too, but like, I don't know, somewhere there was something good in there. What was good? Yeah, I mean, it's the sort of thing though where I feel like the third time you tell a story set in this time, like, it probably shouldn't be as graphic,
right?
You know, I mean, I think there's a lot to be said about like showing certain kinds of traumatic images and like not overdoing that. But at the same time, I think the first time someone sees something, it can have an effect. And I think it can have an effect on people who don't have, you know, Chinese American in-laws, right? And who don't, you know, who aren't black I don't know. I feel like it affected me. I don't know exactly if that's the only reason it affected me. I'm pretty sure that's not the only reason, but that magnified it for me, for sure.
I think there's so much that you're getting at there that's so important. And I want to get back to what you're saying about the way these things can hit us in terms of like our own personal connection to them. Like, as we were talking about it, I was thinking more and more about how anti-trans violence has been something that you know, I mean, all these kind of things are horrible, but like, especially in the last couple of years, there have been a number of instances, particularly of trans women, especially sex workers and trans women of color, being killed in just brutal ways that have always just, I think, even before I really came out to myself about being non-binary and transgender, really bothered me. I think probably because I felt a connection there. But I wanted to start by what you were saying there about that kind of hard balance of like, you know, when is showing something so much that it's becoming exploitative or even like torture porn, which, to be fair, I think there's other parts of Warrior that definitely fall into the torture porn category. It doesn't ever reach Game of Thrones level, but like there's some aspect of it. This scene, I feel like, and again, I'm not someone who grew up with the fear of this happening to me or the knowledge that it happened to people like me, so maybe I can very much understand someone looking at this and being like, that was too graphic, no one should show that in television. But I also know that it did hit me incredibly hard because it was graphic. And because, of course, like I was looking at it immediately thinking of Emmett Till. I was immediately thinking about the lynchings that have happened in our own culture, you know, in our parents' lifetimes.
In our lifetimes, like 5 years ago, or a bunch of...
Yeah, no, very true. The thing, though, that came to mind, especially for me, though, as we're having this conversation about, like, you know, is it too much, but also the importance of showing it to begin with, is in again, talking the context that I know best, in queer circles that I'm part of, where we're talking about, like, movies and things like that, we got to a point where people were very upset that every story about queer people, especially about gay men, had to always include either someone being attacked in a gay bashing, or even more, there had to be a character who died of AIDS. And that there's sort of there was a push of like, can we stop telling gay tragedies? Can we have gay love stories? Can we have gay happy stories? Can we have stories about gay superheroes or gay bank robbers or gay whatever it is, and not just always be about those things? And I think that's very true. I think it became an exploitative trope in that regard. But it's funny, just now I'm getting choked up. Just a couple of days ago, there was a picture that was posted as part of Pride celebrations, and it was a choir, but most of the people in the choir were dressed all in black. A couple were dressed in I think in white, maybe in lighter colors, and it was like maybe like 6 people out of like 100 people on the stage. And those 6 were the surviving members of the San Francisco Gay Men's Choir from like the early 80s, I believe, because all the rest of them had died of AIDS. And it hit me so hard because one of the things that reminded me of was when I was 17 and I first started to understand that I was bisexual, I went to you know, queer community meetings, gay and lesbian community meetings and things like that. And one thing I was really struck by was that I was looking for role models. I was looking for men in their, you know, 20s, 30s, and 40s that I, as a 17-year-old, could look up to. And being struck by the fact that, like, almost all the people of that generation were women. And it was because of HIV and AIDS and how much that had just utterly devastated, you know, the numerous generations of gay men and queer men and queer people of all genders, but especially of those especially queer men. And so to me, I think that's kind of what I think about, and that to me, like, I remember the first times I saw that portrayed in movies and how incredibly painful and devastating it was, but also necessary, you know. And I can say that, like, so for that experience, I needed to see that in film, and I think a lot of other people did, but also that it became exploitative. And I can't claim to be an expert on, like, where is the line for that in terms of the kind of attack that happens in Warrior, the lynching. And I'd be very curious to hear other people's perspectives on it, because I don't think it's easy to say where that line is. But I just say, like, I feel like there's incredible power on both sides. It can become exploitative. It can become, like, a hard thing to show, and that it becomes kind of torture porn. But that, like, I think you're right. I bet I went into watching Warrior knowing on an intellectual level that terrible things had happened to Chinese Americans in the 1800s.
Yeah.
But I'd never known the name of someone who terrible thing happened to, the way I know the name of, like, an Emmett Till.
Right.
And to see it in such graphic terms was painful and difficult, but made me a lot more aware of it. It made me want to go to Wikipedia and read more about it. Not that Wikipedia is by any means the expert,
Right.
but that at
It's
least
a place to get a taste of
and I have
story,
some
and
books
then
now
you
on my
can
Audible
dig
shelf
deeper.
that I want to get to that go into more detail about that. And when I saw that scene, I wanted to quit watching the show because it was so upsetting to me. Also, some stuff about kind of the way it narratively happened. Like, it felt like they kept giving you hope that he was actually going to live, but then taking it away. And I think, and Kamal didn't say this, but I think it goes back to the point that Kamal said in the first thing. Like, real life doesn't follow the narrative patterns we want. It doesn't often make for a good story by any means. And what happened of the police thinking they were going to be okay and then realizing, like, the mob was there and the police making some attempt to fight the mob, but as you said, like, they weren't going to use guns. It wasn't, they didn't want to do it for their people, to defend one of those people. It is incredibly hard to watch, and I think that I'm a better person for having watched it.
Yeah, I feel that. I mean, I feel gutted just like thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the same way like it, and talking about like showing things or not showing things, it makes me think of Judas and the Black Messiah,
right?
Which I guess spoiler alert. There's a prominent assassination that takes place, and they do it off screen in that movie.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's deliberate. I think that's very deliberate.
Yeah.
But I think we've seen so many stories of racist violence against black people in this country that it's like maybe like it's enough,
Yeah.
and stories on the news also, right? But like I feel like sometimes you need to tell the story in its brutal, naked, absolute awfulness.
Right.
And then sometimes you don't tell the story that way.
And
Like,
just
don't
to be
make
clear,
that every story.
when you say it's enough, you don't mean that like we should stop telling stories about.
Oh, hell no.
Yeah,
hell no.
I knew that. I just want to make very clear because
thank you for the clarification. Yeah, no. I mean, first of all, I really enjoyed Judas and the Black Messiah, and I would recommend it to people. And I think it's a story that absolutely needs to be told, and I don't think had been told that way to that point.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's tons more stories that need to be told. I would like to, if we look at the 1880s California, 1870s, whatever, like, I think there's tons of stories you can tell in that timeline.
Right.
I don't think they all need to have a graphically shown lynching.
Yeah.
I
mean, there are characters in the TV show Warrior who get to kind of ride off and have their own saloon, and they have some hard times, but they basically get to have kind of a happy experience of being that's even overstating it, but they get to have a more positive experience of being a Chinese person in America. And like, I'd love to have a TV show just about that,
Oh yeah, no, that 100%, that's the number one spinoff from that, and Assam and what's his name, Lee.
Oh yeah. they're a great team up. Would be fantastic.
No, those would be great.
But yeah, I think that's the thing, is I think that, like, when every story about gay people involved the queer bashing or the death from AIDS, it dramatically limited those experiences.
Yeah.
But those things are also all part of the experience, and that's why it's necessary. And I think that that's kind of true here. And and here I don't know how you can do this for fiction. I don't know if you can, because I do think also that there's an extent to which, like, different audiences need to see different things. And what I'm thinking here in part of is, for a while, as part of the, like, Black Lives Matter movement, especially as, like, white people trying to be supportive of that, you had a habit of, like, and I certainly was a part of this, of, like, any news story about a black person or a person of color being the victim of police violence, which there are just so many, splash that on the news. Make sure it's in front of every white person you can think of. Make sure it's in front of every person you can think of. Put it all over your Twitter feed. Put it all over your Facebook feed. Many times those stories included, graphic, horrible, terrible to watch police videos, or, pictures of, Michael Brown's body lying dead on the ground, or whatever it is. And I think that my understanding of the need for that movement was deepened by seeing those pictures. And I think it was important for me to see those pictures. I also know that more recently that there's been a real pushback of saying like, hey, listen, white folk, every time you put those pictures on your Twitter feed for your like attempt, there's one person who basically made a great TikTok about this who was like, listen, like, remember that every time you're doing that, you are re-traumatizing people of color on your feed. And she was speaking very like frank and harsh terms, but I understood where she was coming from. It was like, I don't understand why you white people need to see our dead bodies in order to understand that we should be alive, but don't shove them in our faces either. Yeah. And she had a point. And I'm like, it shouldn't have taken those pictures to help me understand just how deep it was. But also, and like one thing I've started seeing more often is people posting things like, hey, listen, this terrible thing happened. White friends, if you like, this is a video that you probably need to see. Anyone else who, if you don't, or, maybe not in those stark terms, but basically saying like, look, here's a video. And if you're white, you probably, it may be really hard to watch this, and maybe that's an uncomfort you need to go through. Maybe you don't, but if you're a person of color, like, please, I'm putting this here to kind of protect you from that. And what I'm talking about here, I think, is such a more complicated issue, and I'm probably explaining it very badly. But I get that, because honestly, I don't feel like I need those videos or those pictures anymore. But every time a story comes out, I watch them, and it's uncomfortable. And there's a part of me that feels like until that problem is fixed, and it's probably never going to be in my lifetime, but I don't feel like it's ever okay for me to get to a point where I'm like, you know what, I'm going to stop watching those videos because they're uncomfortable, because I want to keep. And even as I talk about it, like, there's such a, like, I don't want to sound like a martyr or some bullshit like that, or because the traumatization porn is such a thing, and I think it's definitely easy to be like, oh, well, I watched the video, I sat with the uncomfort. Like, no, fuck that. You got to go out and do something. You got to translate that into action. But all this is a very different topic, but I think it's just kind of getting to this idea of, I think media like that is going to be seen differently by different people. And I think these conversations are important, and I'm so glad, Kamal, you wrote in. I'm so glad that other people wrote in about that show because, Paul, even as we talked about, your and my experiences of it were so different. And I think my experience of it's powerful and important, and I learn more by hearing your experience. I learn more by hearing Kamal talk about it. I learn more by hearing anyone else talk about it. I just said 8 totally different, unrelated things, so go ahead and pick whatever the hell you want to respond to.
I don't know. I feel like, it's a lot of things. I hear what you're saying about all those, and there's a lot of things that are connected. I mean, there's some things that I feel like just a person should probably see one time and then understand that that's part of the world.
Yeah. And
then maybe you don't have to see it again that way. Maybe some people do have to see things a number of times. If I watch the show again, I might not be looking at the screen when that happens. Yeah. I don't necessarily need to sit with the images again to really understand, the shit that's going on and the shit that's gone on.
Yeah.
But I do feel like it made it like real for me in another way, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. It's just it kind of circles back to the what I don't know if I said it today or some other time, but just like I feel like we need more stories told by more people.
Yeah. That
more people can access, and it's not like particular stories need to be for certain groups of people, but like certain stories, the way that they're told are just going to hit different people differently. And so like the more voices that kind of have room to express themselves and be heard, and we can kind of find what is like what we need to watch. Right. I think and Warrior's an interesting show because like the first episode, the first 10 minutes, I was not sure whether I liked it or hated it.
Yeah, that's fair.
And I ended up loving it with some reservations. But, one last thing I'll say about Jacob is like, they don't kill a lot of named characters in that show.
Right.
They kill a lot of red shirts,
Yeah.
Like, there's a lot of extras who are like, oh, well, we don't know who that is, so they're probably going to get killed.
Very true.
But, like, when, he was one of the few named characters that they killed, and, I think it adds a little bit of weight that way, even though it's an extremely bloody show. The fact that this is, this one character that is kind of also unique within the story, right? Mm-hmm. He's kind of the only, Chinese character that we see interacting mostly with like the white folks.
Right.
And, doesn't work out too well for him. But,
yeah, I mean, I think, and that's, in some ways, that's one of the things that makes it so painful, is it does feel like he's being punished because he was, like, he didn't just stick to his own kind or something like that. Like, not that I think that the people who kill him, like, they don't even know that and they don't care.
Right.
But that seems almost kind of like the perspective of the story in some ways.
And a lot of the harm that potentially comes to some of the other characters is usually with their contacts with, Right. I mean, like Assam, like, gets arrested because he's trying to help the same person.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it is such an intense topic, and it's funny also because one of the examples that I just wanted to bring up as, I think another thing like the kind of Fred Hampton movie you mentioned where, and I've mentioned this before, but I think a great example of another place where someone has said, look, there's a kind of dynamic that the story needs to keep being told, but we don't need to keep putting it on screen, especially in exploitative ways. And that's Birds of Prey, with the topic of like sexual and other kind of violence towards women. Yeah. Where, and I've talked about this at length, I'll just kind of very quickly summarize it here, but like there's two instances where men are attacking women in horrible, and in one case very kind of like clearly sexual ways, and the camera turns away so that you are clearly aware of just how horrible this is, but like small spoilers for Birds of Prey, like there's literally a moment where the villain like forces a woman to strip, and the camera turns away just as she does, so that you see like the dress starting to come off, you see the horrified and like upset look on her face, but you never actually see her body without the dress on, which happens so often. And frankly, like, one of the things I disliked most about Warrior is they did that. Like there's a scene where there's horrible violence happening to women, and it's done in that very like Game of Thrones, like kind of not they're like eroticized, but definitely like, how horrible it is that this naked woman, and let's have the camera focus on her nudity kind of a thing. So and I think that's just kind of a like, I'm not saying that like, oh, Warrior's terrible, but it's a like, even within the same show, I think it's really telling that on some issues they can be really doing these things in powerful ways, and other ways it feels, and maybe it's, I mean, maybe you could say like they're doing the same thing with both of those two things, but because I'm going to take
context.
I think
that makes sense. I think.
Yeah, but I think
they're doing something similar.
Yeah, but the context of how those stories are told is so different, especially because one of them we've seen all the time and the other we haven't.
Yeah.
So, anyway, I think that's about all we can say on that. Paul, unless you have any last thoughts, but I would just say, Kamal, again, thank you so much for both of those, but especially this one, because it was funny because I didn't read Kamal's email until I'd finished the show. I know, Paul, you had. And so I think actually I said to Paul something like, well, I don't know if I want to watch this show anymore. I'm so upset about what just happened. But I also know we got listener feedback about the show. And I think I literally asked you, do I need to keep watching in order to get to the thing that the listener feedback is about? And you were like, well, come to think of it, like,
technically no.
So Kamal, you hit on the thing that we most wanted to talk about anyway. So well done, and thank you.
For sure.
That's the last of our feedback. Paul, do you have any last wrap up comments about anything specific? Or
so I do have an issue with one thing Kamal said. It's a very nitty issue that is mostly raised for comedy, but I'm going to quote from the first one about Invincible. How are U.S. sports teams world champions in a sport no one else plays? Touche. But I feel like this neglects to respect the world championships of the Toronto Blue Jays.
This is true. This is true.
I just and I guess the Raptors, right? Is the NBA considered the world championship, or is it just the NBA champion? Is that only baseball that's like, this is the World Series, almost entirely played inside the United States, except occasionally Canada?
I mean, because the Olympics now has basketball as an Olympic sport, and there are like world championships. I mean, heck, there isn't even like a baseball World Cup.
Right.
But I think
there is literally.
Yeah, I think
the World Baseball Classic. No.
Yeah, I don't think they've had that for a while though. But I certainly I haven't watched much sports because I'm not going to watch Plague Ball. when it's like safe to watch again. I've started paying attention to baseball again. I don't feel great about it, but
it is what it is.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say, what the hell's that pitcher's name?
Yeah, 2013 was discounted. Okay, 2011 was the last one. I haven't followed baseball since 2011 because I was angry about something that then doesn't look as good in retrospect. But whatever, we're moving on.
Exactly, but yeah, I think they probably do still use those terms, and yeah, when I was reading that email, I was like, well, it's not just the U.S., but yeah, the idea.
It's an excellent point, but technically.
And I want to make a comment about how basically Canada is kind of like America with better comedians and better healthcare, but then we're going to get a whole bunch of angry emails from people throwing maple syrup at us and just, all sorts of...
Oh, you went there. You went there. In a show where we're showing respect to Kim's Convenience, now we end up with throwing maple syrup as
Listen, the Canadian TV, Kim's Convenience was definitely very good. I don't know if you've seen it yet, but Schitt's Creek is... not really superhero related, but honestly one of the best TV shows that I've ever seen. Also Canadian. Battlestar Galactica was shot, I think, mostly in Vancouver and had an awful lot of Canadian actors.
Oh, a lot of shows are shot largely in Vancouver, yeah.
So, and their maple syrup is better than ours. So, throw it away. Throw it at us. I mean, go ahead and throw away.
Okay, I'm going to tell a very brief baseball story of the last time I think I went to a baseball game with Matthew. It was.
I apologize.
A's
now
Yankees.
we're coming up on hour 3. We've been going for a while. We're
No. This is going to be 10 seconds.
Go for it.
It was the playoffs. The A's were playing the Yankees. The A's were winning. We were at Yankee Stadium, rooting rather loudly for the A's, particularly Matthew. He was very into it.
We are baseball fans and thus don't like the Yankees. Go on.
Some fans started throwing peanuts at us from behind. I realized that these were shelled peanuts, or peanuts in the shell, and I was like, oh, I'm just going to eat these. Thanks for the peanuts. They stopped throwing the peanuts.
That was a beautiful moment. And I think on that lovely tangent, we can call this over.
I was also going to bring up that we keep using the term blind spot, and I'm not sure if that's offensive or not.
Yeah.
But I thought I would name that.
No, that's a fair point and one that I appreciate you bringing up. Yeah,
and if it is, and anybody has any comments on that, I would enjoy that feedback as well.
I think that's a whole other episode we can do at some point because it certainly comes up in these stories. It comes up as you talk about them. I don't know if this is unique to English or if this is just a part of humanity, but like most of our language that talks about things in negative ways does so by comparing it to other things that we think are negative that are pretty like kind of terrible when you think about like the terms that are used for like being cheated economically are anti-Semitic or anti-Romani, or like all the many terms that we use for people who we think are not acting in intelligent ways are actually like pretty offensive to people with developmental disabilities. And you're right, yeah, we use
a lot of ableists, right?
Yeah, I mean it's something I should definitely think about more because I'm often like pointing people out like, hey, can you not use the word lame? But my talk about like people being blinded by things is probably just as bad. So yeah, thank you for pointing that out. Okay, so I think on that note, I will start us to wrap us up. Thank you all, listeners. Thank you so much. Obviously, this is all driven by your feedback, and would love your feedback on our feedback. A lot of times we'll just kind of work something right into an episode, but here we just had a number of ones that we wanted to get into a real discussion of. So thank you all so much. Please keep the feedback coming. You can find us on Facebook or Twitter at The Ethical Panda. There are pages for Superhero Ethics and Star Wars Universe podcast, but they both kind of point you back towards The Ethical Panda. That's the main place I'm doing stuff. You can also email us at theethicalpanda@gmail.com. Another way to find me recently is under Twitch TV, twitch.tv, The Ethical Panda. I've been doing streams where I'm learning how to play Pot Limit Omaha Poker. I've been a decent poker player for quite a while. Made my living at it for a short period of time. I'm not really that good anymore. I was never that good. I was able to kind of exploit some things. But I'm trying to get better, largely with Paul's help. And so I'm doing streams where I'm playing poker, talking somewhat about poker, but also talking about, these kind of issues. Like last night I did one on Loki and time travel. I did one before about some Star Wars stuff. So it's always fun to check out. I'm trying to do it on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Sunday nights starting at 9:30 Central Time. I'm by no means always doing it at the same time. But, if you're on Twitch TV, check it out. If you give a follow to The Ethical Panda, that'd be great. You'll get notifications when I go live, but also just it helps me, helps get my numbers up. But more than anything, what I would do is support the person who's teaching me how to do these things on Twitch. Paul, talk about...
That's me!
Yeah, what are you doing on Twitch TV these days?
At the moment, at twitch.tv/ZenMadman, I am streaming poker every morning at 10 a.m. Pacific, noon Central. If you could give a follow, it would be greatly appreciated. You can also turn off notifications if poker isn't quite your jam, but you can also tweet at me, ZenMadman on the Twitter, and suggest streams that you would like to see. I'm open to doing all sorts of different streams. In the past, I've done a lot of chess and Duolingo, and, maybe I could be persuaded to rant about whatever, show I may or may not have watched recently.
It is very hard to find a way to get Paul talking about things, but if you do, it's definitely a rewarding experience. So.
It's definitely a long experience.
Yes. Say it's 2 hours later, as Paul and I are supposed to now start my next poker lesson, and we're both kind of punch drunk, so we'll see how that goes. But anyway, thank you so much for being great fans. I didn't know if I could do feedback episodes when I got started. The fact that we have this much feedback, and frankly, we've gotten so much other great feedback over the months and years. You fans, you make this worthwhile. Like, it is a lot of work doing this. It's a lot of fun. Paul and I love talking about this, but, I could do this without talk to Paul about it without editing it all the time. But it makes it worth it because I love the feedback we're getting. I love that we're having an impact. I love that you all are having an impact on us and giving us new things to think about and challenging us to think about it in new ways. Giving us new things to think about. I'm super excited to see insurance adjusters in a superhero world. That sounds so much fun. So thank you all. Check out my other podcast, Star Wars Universe Podcast. Check out all the other great podcasts about MCU stuff, Star Trek, all sorts of great things on the Stranded Panda Podcast Network. And most importantly, if you want to, have a great day.